So I just want to give you some detail on the assessment side of this module. Now, this slide you're looking at is actually one I showed you back in January. The only difference is I have added some dates to it. So I'm setting July 17th as the hand-up date for the lab work and August 23rd for the assessment. Sorry, for the assignment of the project. In terms of the lab work, as I would have mentioned to you, what you will be submitting is your GitHub repository, and I've already highlighted the importance of the Git log. Effectively, what you will do is you'll submit a simple little text file to Moodle, where the text file will contain the URL of your GitHub repo. I'll give you the link for the Moodle submission later on. Now, in terms of the assignment of the project, again, I've given you the heads up as to the high-level objective of this. You can either take the option of extending the Movies app from the starting point would be the end of part 4 of the series of labs, or alternatively, you can design and develop a custom React app for some other API, whether that be the point of interest API that you developed in Enterprise Web or some other open API that you may be aware of. I am restricting you in option 2 to using the Create React app. So you do have to use that tool as your starting point. And you'll also need to use Storybook, obviously, because you will be developing your own custom components. Now, in relation to the movies, if you're extending the movies fan app, option 1 there, I am saying there that you have to use a different GitHub repo for that. I'll explain how you do that maybe in the next slide. In terms of what you'll be submitting then for the assignment, again, it'll be a GitHub repository. You just give me the URL. That GitHub repository will need to have a README file, and I will give you a template for the structure of that README file. It's important that you follow that structure exactly, because I do use the README as part of my assessing process. Obviously, you should maintain a Git history as you work your way through the assignment. So my advice is to do a Git commit almost at the end of every session that you carry out in your development, whether you have completed something or not. Just do a Git commit with a reasonably explanatory commit message. So you'll be submitting the GitHub repo to me, and also you'll be submitting a short video where you demonstrate the work that you've done. And again, I can give you some more details on that when it gets closer to the hand update. It'll only be about a 10-minute video, I'd imagine, that at most. Now, if you are deciding to take option 1, in other words, to extend the Movies app, you need to do a little bit of setup before you start working on the assignment. First of all, what you need to do is go to your Movies app folder and make a copy of that folder. Before you make the copy, I'd advise you to delete the node modules first of all, then just make a copy of the Movies app folder. And let's suppose we, for the sake of discussion, we call the copy assignment. So that's a new folder now that's going to have all of the source code that we've developed so far. Then in the assignment folder, by the way, if you want to reinstall the node modules in your Movies app folder, you can do that. But concentrating on the assignment folder now, this is what you need to do. Effectively, what we want to do down here is we want to link the local Git repository with a different GitHub repo. That's what I'm doing here. So anyway, you have your assignments folder, just import it into VS Code. And then open up an integrated terminal and type this command. And what this command is doing is it is breaking the link between the local Git repository in your assignment folder with the GitHub repo that the GitHub repo repository that you were pushing to when you were working in your movies app folder. So I'm breaking that link, and then I'm saying go away and create a new repository up on GitHub, and then type this command. You're typing this command now from within your assignments folder. So you're now making a link between the local Git repository in your assignment folder with this new GitHub repo that you've just created. Do your npm install to install the node modules locally, and then you can work from there. So you now have your assignments folder. It has a Git repository, a local Git repository with all of the commits that you have made up to now as part of your lab work. But you have associated the Git repository in your assignments folder with a different repo up on GitHub. You still have your movies app folder, okay, and it is associated with another GitHub repo, the original GitHub repo that you have. Okay, so that's kind of your setup that you need to carry out. Now, in terms of assessing this assignment, I have defined 4 grade bands. If we look at the 40 to 55% grade band first, then essentially I'm trying to establish that you have the foundation skill sets associated with developing a React app. That's the kind of theme that I'm defining here. And I guess you would be, in this case, you would be reusing the components structures and the page structures that I have already given you in the labs. You'd be reusing those, repurposing them to develop, let's say, about 3 new views that have to be a certain amount of dynamics or interactivity in the new views. In terms of the routing, at least one of those new pages would be linked with a parameterized URL. So for example, you might use, there's a TMDB endpoint that gives you a list of the top rated movies of all time. So that might be another new page that you would add. And clearly you would be reusing a lot of the components that you already have to achieve that. There's another TMDB endpoint that gives you a list of similar movies to a movie. So you can imagine on the movies detail page, there might be a new link where that link would display a list of movies that are similar to the one that you've just been looking at. Again, that list of movies would more than likely render the exact same way as the other movie listing pages that we have. So you get the idea that you are essentially reusing the components and page structures that you've already developed and just using them for different purposes. So roughly 3 new views would be sufficient. You'd need to do a little bit of extra storybook stuff as well. You might take the movie details page and add some more information onto that, because I've only displayed some of the information that's contained in a movie object. That's kind of the general outline that would be required for this grade band. Now, more than likely, in this grade band, you are probably extending the movies app. Maybe not. It may also apply to the option 2, where you're using the point of interest backend as your the point of interest as your backend, and you're developing a React app for that. But maybe the look and feel of the React app is very similar to the movies app. Instead of a list of movies, we're displaying a list of points of interest using the movie card component as your structure for displaying one movie. The equivalent of the movie's detail page would be a point of interest details page, which again would have the same layout, let's say. So that's that grade band. In the next grade band, which I'm just labeling as very good, so we're up to 55 to 70% now. Now you're developing your own components and you are developing a different page structure, let's say, maybe different UI look and feel to your pages, the new pages that you're developing. I'm saying, the theme is kind of you're a confident developer. You have the confidence to develop your own components at this stage. So in terms of kind of the volume of code that you need to be developing, I'm saying roughly there would be 5 new views if you're extending the Movies app API, 5 views in total if your backend is something other than TMDB. I'm saying as well that you should have extensive hyperlinking. Now, there's 2 ways that you can navigate around any web app. You either navigate using navigation links at the top in the header and the footer maybe, or there may be hyperlinks embedded within the body of your pages. And it's those embedded links within the body of the page. That's what I'm getting at here by extended hyperlinking. If you think of the Movies app and the Movies detail page, well, sorry, if you think of the movie listing pages, we had a more info link associated with every card. So that's an example of hyperlinking. On the Movies detail page, when we clicked on the review button, we were given a list of reviews. In the list of reviews, we had a hyperlink that brought us to a detail list, a detail of the details on that review. Now, when you're aiming for this grade band, then if we just look down at the data model part, I'm saying that your data model now has more than 2 entities in it. In the previous grade band, I specified that your data model was probably about 2 entities, and that was the case, let's say, in the Movies app that we developed in the lab. We had the movie entity and we had the review entity, and there's a one-to-many relationship between those. So that was the kind of size of the data model. Whereas when we're looking at this grade band here, the very good grade band, your data model is going to be bigger than that, perhaps 3 entities. So for example, TMDB, as well as having information on movies, it also has information on actors. So we now have the movie type, the movie entity type, the review entity type, and the actor entity type. And TMDB has lots of cross relationships between movies and actors. You can get a list of the actors on a particular movie. You can get all of the movies that an actor has taken part in. So we could display all of that kind of information in our app across different new pages. I'm also saying that you should really probably bring in the caching, the React query library at this stage, and do a lot of caching of your server-side's data. You can have the appropriate storybook support for the new components and that you will develop, or if you extend existing components, then you'll need the storybook support to ensure they work. In terms of routing there, I'm talking about bringing in authentication. So I have given you an implementation of authentication as part of the routing samples that we looked at. So you could literally lift that code and bring it into your assignment. Essentially kind of stitch it into your assignments, or stitching it into the Movies app if that's the one that you're opting for. Now I'm saying that the authentication can be just basic. What I mean by that is username passwords can be stored in a simple array within your JavaScript code. So there's no server side involved here in validating username password combinations. And where this might work into our Movies app, for example, let's supposing the list, the home page is public. Anybody can show that page. Anybody can navigate to the details page on a particular movie. Anybody can read the reviews on movies. But if you want to tag a movie as a favorite, then you have to authenticate first. You have to log in first before you're allowed to do that. Also, you can't navigate to the favorite movies page unless you've authenticated, or you can't add a review unless you have logged in first. So they would be the set of private pages and features for the movies app, and the public ones would be, as I mentioned there a while ago. So we've got a nice mix of public and private associated with our movies app, and the equivalent if you're taking the point of interest as your backend or some other API as your backend. Moving on to the excellent grade band, 17 to 90%. And the theme here is independent learning. So, you know, from various maybe blog articles, or you may have looked into the actual docs of some of the, either be the React docs or the documentation associated with React Query or the documentation associated with Material UI. You've actually looked at into the docs, and you've read up on stuff that we haven't really covered in the lectures at all. And you've applied those in your project. So some areas that you might consider, and before I talk about the specific areas that I'm listing here, I'm always open to stuff that I don't mention here. So other is always an option. And just as long as you make sure to mention in the README of the GitHub repo what the others are, then that's fine by me. But here are some areas that you could look at. So in terms of UI, you could bring in some responsiveness. Now we have I've already kind of demonstrated responsiveness in the, how you achieve it actually in the Movies app using Material UI. If you remember, if we just flip over to the these header links here, these navigation links, they change to a drop-down list when our form size is in the kind of mobile range. Also, the number of movies cards listed on a row varies depending on the size of your display area. So that's responsiveness occurring there, and you can see how I implemented those in the code. Now, another area where, another example of where responsiveness could apply would be in the movies detail page. So these images over here, okay, they're fine if your screen size is like this, but if we get into a smaller screen size, it's probably not worth having these over here. So these would disappear when the screen size is in the mobile range. That's just one other example of responsiveness, but you would come up with other examples. It's essentially about reorganizing the contents on the page based on the size of the screen. Either reorganizing the contents or leaving some of the contents out completely because it cannot fit in to a smaller screen size. So responsiveness is one area. There are lots of Material UI components that I didn't use at all. So if you read up on the docs a little bit, or even read articles or blogs linked to Material UI and React, you may come across some components and have an opportunity to use them in your project. That would be great. Or you may read blog articles that mention other third-party components that, again, you would have an opportunity to use in your assignment, and that would be a very good example of independent learning as well. I'm mentioning web forms there as well. Now, we have used one web form using a particular third-party library. I didn't really cover it in the lectures, but it is in the lab. You might see an opportunity to use, or you might have an opportunity to use a web form in the extension that you make to the Movies app or whatever other API, open API you're using. A web form obviously is linked with the idea of adding some data to your data store. But either way, if you can use a web form somewhere within your implementation, because I didn't cover it in any kind of formal way in the lectures, that would be good. In terms of navigation and routing there, I'm now talking about, whereas in the previous gradband, I just said basic authentication was fine. Now I'm saying you should have a more robust authentication backend, for example, using Firebase, if you're familiar with Firebase or if you've heard of it, using JWT implementation in some sort of backend authentication service, or you're talking about a third-party service now that you would be using here to provide the authentication backup for your React app. In terms of the data model, I'm mentioning two things there now that seem a little out of context, but they're not really. So pagination is one thing I'm mentioning there. Now, it turns out in the TMDB, when we asked TMDB for a list of movies from the discovery endpoint, it returns 20 movies. But if you looked at the actual URL that is associated with this request, if I just bring up the code. So here's the URL associated with requesting 20 movies from the discovery endpoint. And if you go right to the end of it, there is a query string. So this is a query string here, as you know, that we're constructing. But at the end of the query string, there's a page parameter set to the value of 1. Now, it turns out that this page parameter can be anything from 1 to 20. And that's an example of, that's really pagination going on there. We are always asking for the first 20 movies, but really TMDB's discovery endpoint can return a total of, I think it's 2,000 videos to it. Now, it doesn't return them all in one go. By specifying a page number that allows TMDB to work out which 20 movies from its full list of discovery movies it should return to us. So what would be nice is if we had on our homepage, or indeed on the upcoming movies, the same thing applies. On the homepage, if we had your kind of standard pagination hyperlink at the bottom that allows you to go on to the next page, to go back to the previous page. How would we achieve that? Now, it turns out that React Query has really nice built-in support for pagination. If we go to, here's the React Query homepage. Obviously, you just enter, if you just Google React Query, and it's almost the first hit. And if you go into the docs and then scroll down to the guides, so you see here pagination queries. So you need to read through that to see, gives you actual sample code, shows you how to implement it. And if you got that working with both the home page and the upcoming page, that would be a nice addition to the Movies app. You could have a similar feature if you're deciding to use the point of interest as your backend. The query string I'm mentioning here as well in relation to the data model. I'll maybe talk about that a little bit later on. And as I said, I'm always open to other ideas. Finally, in the 90% plus bracket, well, that will be kind of dictated by the fact that you have a really rich feature set in your app. So that's really up to your own kind of imagination and how well you have explored, be it the TMDB or how well you've actually used your whatever backend you're using to produce an almost professional standard app, professional in terms of its look and feel, but also in terms of its usefulness in terms of the feature set. The second point here, BaaS stands for Backend as a Service. Now, if you think of the way we are using TMDB at the moment, we're only doing read operations from it. But TMDB supports full CRUD. You can actually write data to your, essentially you will be writing data to your own account within TMDB. You can update that data and you can delete that data. And the data comes in the form of what TMDB calls lists. So you can create your own lists. Now, an example of a list might be your favorite movies. We are storing that list of movies within our React code. We're never persisting it anywhere, but we could actually persist it back in our TMDB account. And again, I'll give you an indication as to where you would look at in the TMDB documentation to find out how to do that. And those lists, you can update them, delete entries from them, create them, etc., etc. So getting that working would be fantastic and would get you into this kind of grade band. By the way, in general, the majority of what you implement might be grade band, let's say the very good grade band, which is this one here. But you may have one or two aspects of this grade band, and that will be rewarded. So it's not a case of you fall into one grade band. You get a percentage at the end of the day, and the percentage is determined by what you've implemented. So the majority of what you implement might be aiming for this, but you may have just one of these achieved. You may have, let's say, added some additional responsiveness to your UI, even though the majority of what you've done is in this area here. You will still get rewarded for the responsiveness achievements that you've made. Now back to here. So yeah, so we're talking now about our React app not just carrying out read operations on our API, but it's also doing full CRUD on our API. So you're making HTTP post and put and delete requests from your React app to your backend. Or, as always, there may be some other aspect to single page app, React single page app development that you've brought into your implementation, and that will be rewarded as well. Finally, just a little bit on TMDB, because we have really only kind of scratched the surface in relation to it. There are many, many other endpoints that we could have utilized. And I think what I would recommend is that you spend, I would say, about an hour or so just browsing the documentation on the various other endpoints and use that information to give you an indication as to where you might do some further development. You've got a link to the docs there, and I'll look at them in a moment. But so one of the endpoints that we have used is the discovery endpoint, but even that endpoint itself has a lot more flexibility to it than we made use of. You can actually, using the query string in the discovery endpoint, you can be very specific about the types of movies that you're looking for by using a set of key value pairs on the query string itself. And when you look at the discovery documentation in the docs, it'll give you a list of all of the query string options that are available to you and how you should use them. So if we just flip over to the code, I hard coded my query string so that I was only looking for movies in English, I think. I wasn't interested in adult movies, and it was just page 1. So it's purely hard coded. But you can do things like, for example, if I wanted movies that were released on a particular year in a certain language and various with a certain certification, you can make those kind of essentially search requests to TMDB, to its discovery endpoint, and it will return the matching movies to you. So a really nice feature, for example, would be if you had a page that was just a web form, and the various fields on that web form would allow you to configure the query string for the discovery request that you're about to make. Some of those fields on the web form would be drop-down lists. There wouldn't be free text. Many of them might be drop-down lists, but either way, the user is allowed to configure the type of search of the discovery endpoint that they want to make. And then having filled out the form, and there would obviously be default values on form fields that the user didn't fill out. By clicking submit, they would be taken to the movies listing page, or a movies listing page that would list the matching movies. So that's the discovery endpoint. The movies endpoint has lots of other angles to it as well. All we looked at was to get the details on a movie, to get the list of reviews associated with a movie, to get the list of upcoming movies, but there are all these other ones as well. I've already kind of indicated that you can get what they're called the credits associated with a movie, where credits are the cast and crew as TMDB describes them. So you get a list essentially of the person IDs for each cast member, crew member associated with the movie. And then with that person ID, you can get further information on that individual. You can get a list of similar movies to a movie. You can get a list of recommendations associated with a movie. You can get the most popular or top-rated movies of all time. All of these options are available to you. There's a people's kind of area where people here refer to the cast and crew associated with all the movies that are documented on TMDB. So you can get the detailed bio of a particular person. You can get the credits, the movie credits and TV credits associated with that person. You can get a list of images of the individual. So some nice stuff there as well. There's a lists area, and I've highlighted this because this is linked to the backend as a service and CRUD support that I was talking about a moment ago. The lists area, or the lists endpoint, is where you interact with in order to create lists and store them in your account on TMDB. So, your favorites, your must watch lists, your favorite actors, all this kind of stuff. It's a little bit tricky getting that to work because you have to essentially first of all, ask TMDB for a token. Then with the token, you have to request a session ID. And then with the session ID, you're essentially fully authenticated with TMDB. And then you can go making post and put and delete requests to your lists. So you'd have to read up on that, and it's a little bit involved, which is why I've put it in the very top of my grading bands to get that working. But it's not just movies. If TV and TV series is your thing, there's a whole series of endpoints related to those as well. Here are some sample URLs back in the kind of movies area again. So a URL like this, what does it do? It gives you, that returns the cast and crew members, just their identifiers and some brief information about them in an object structure. So you have the movie ID and /credits, and you get that. So here's an example of a URL for, with an actual movie ID. You'd have to include your API key, obviously, within the query string part of this request as well. This URL returns detailed information on a particular person. This URL is an example where you're getting a list of recommendations associated with a movie. This one returns a list of similar movies to a movie. Similarity is based on the genre of this movie and some keywords associated with this movie. As stored in TMDB, you can't control the keywords. So as I said, go look at the docs using this link here, and that will bring you to here. And then you just poke around, really. So for example, the discovery endpoint is documented here. Does jump around a little bit, unfortunately. So this is the one that we would have used a lot. And so get discovery/movie, that returns a list of movies to it. But if you scroll down, it tells you that you can include a query string and here's the query string, and if you expand it, you get the full list of, here's some of the keys that you can use in the query string. But if you see, there are quite a number of them. Looks like there are 31 in total. So there's lots of possibilities there. I wouldn't go trying to use all 31, obviously, but you could have, as I said, a simple web form that allows the user to select values or enter values for some of these query string values, keys, and then clicking the submit on that web form would cause TMDB to return matching movies. So it's a search feature, essentially. And if I go back to these slides, that's what I was talking about here. Back to my documentation. The movies endpoint is the one that we used a lot. But you can see there's lots of options there. Get details on a movie, get the credits associated with a movie, cast and crew, in other words. Get similar movies, get recommendations. Where's the recommendations? Here. So as I say, spend some time browsing around, just going down to the lists area. There's the people's area, which you can, where you get detailed information on actors and actresses and crew members. The lists, you can see that all of the types of requests, they're all GET requests. So they're all read operations, but when you go into the lists area, you have post and delete and put options as well. So that's where you're getting TMDB to create what it calls lists, and those lists are linked to your TMDB account. And the lists can be, it's usually a list of movies, but the nature of the list is up to you to define. So favorites and so on. I just want to briefly go back to this grade band here. So I'm talking about you developing your own custom components and your own, perhaps your own custom page layouts. It's fine to have a mixture of the page layouts that we developed in the labs mixed in with other pages that have different layouts that wouldn't be normal in a React app or any type of single page app. You'd like all of your pages to have a consistency, but here it's fine if the new page layout, if you decide to have a different page layout for certain views, if that layout is very different to the layout that we would have developed in the labs, it's okay to have that inconsistency, if you like, in the new views.